welcome to this joint event between the Black Feminist Bookshop and Housemans. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. For those of you who don't know the Black Feminist Bookshop, we run pop-ups and events to promote the healing and liberation of Black women, femmes, girls, and non-binary people, and empower communities to create radical social change. We are building a community of like-minded and like-hearted people through fostering conversations, resource sharing, and knowledge sharing inspired by the works and legacies of Black feminist writers. Follow us on Instagram at Black Feminist Bookshop. For those of you who don't know Housemans, they are one of the oldest and few remaining radical bookshops in the UK. They are based in King's Cross and they are currently open in-store and online for orders. Their events program is currently entirely online and they have a lot more talks and discussions coming up over the next few weeks. So please take a look at their website for more information at housemans.com. Thank you especially to those of you who have brought solidarity tickets. It's important to us that we keep these events as affordable and as accessible as possible, so you help us to keep running these events. For tonight's events, we are so excited to be joined by Gina Dent, Beth Ritchie, authors, academics, and prison abolitionists, and Aviah Sarah, lecturer, activist, and a member of the direct action group Sisters Uncut. We are here to celebrate the publication of Angela Y. Davis, Gina Dent, and Erica Miner's and Beth Ritchie's new book, Abolition, Feminism Now, published by Penguin. Now for introductions. Gina Dent is Associate Professor of Feminist Studies, History of Consciousness, and Legal Studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She is the editor of Black Popular Culture and lectures and writes on the African diaspora, literary and cultural studies, post-colonial theory, and critical area studies. Her current project, Visualizing Abolition, grows out of her work as an advocate for transformative and transnational justice and prison abolition. Next, we have Beth Ritchie, who is the Professor of Criminology, Law and Justice and Black Studies, Sociology, Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Her most recent book is Arrested Justice, Black Women, Violence and America's Prison Nation. And then we have Aviah Sarah, who can be found teaching and researching at Birkbeck University of London while working, and organising in her East London community at the rest of the time. She is involved in Sisters Uncut, a national direct action collective fighting cuts to domestic violence services and state violence, as well as Hackney Cop Watch. She is co-author of the book Abolition, Revolution with Shanice McBean, which is due to be published by Pluto Press in autumn 2022. There is a Q&A box to post your questions, as well as a chat box for discussion with other attendees, and we'll be keeping an eye on both of them. And if you feel like tweeting, we're at Housemans Books. Now for some housekeeping. Beth, Gina, and Aviah look forward to your questions and comments. There will be some time at the end of discussion for this. If you have a question for our authors or Aviah, please use the Q&A box, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. In the Q&A box, you can ask questions anonymously and also upvote for questions asked by members of the audience that you would like to see answered. In the instance of a disconnection or technical mishap, please bear with us. We will do everything we can to reestablish the connection. Your patience is appreciated. Once again, thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed tonight's discussion. And now over to our guests, Beth Ritchie, Gina Dent, and Aviah Sarah.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. So yeah, I'm going to be in conversation with Gina Dent and Beth Ritchie this evening, or this evening for me anyway. And I'm extremely excited for this event. I even got my eyebrows done specially. And to give you a bit of context on why this is such an important conversation and why this book could not have come at a better time for a lot of us in Britain. We're in the midst of a growing abolitionist movement here in Britain. After we saw unprecedented numbers turnout against racism in summer 2020. And I can tell you, people don't often turn out in Britain streets for anti-racism. And a growing crisis for British policing after the police murder of Sarah Everard. Then, after the violent police crackdown against Sisters Uncut and women at Sarah Everard's vigil, what has emerged over the last year has been a growing crisis for British policing, and an abolitionist movement which is organising to further that crisis. This is the movement against the anti-Black, anti-Gypsy, Roma traveller and anti-protest bill, which is the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill, and the growing movement of localised cop watch groups, which seeks to make this bill ungovernable at the street level, as well as make all police powers ungovernable. So our abolitionist strategy is to withdraw consent from policing, and withdraw consent as an abolitionist strategy specifically speaks to policing in the British context. And I'm really interested in the internationalism of this book, which I'm going to ask a question about in a moment. But that specific kind of withdraw consent strategy, it speaks to the context for policing here in Britain, which has generally historically been careful to appear as if it's kind of try and garner the consent of the public, or at least appear to be policing by the consent of the public. And the British Empire exported policing around the rest of the world, but the policing it meted out in the colonies and settler colonies, where it had no legitimacy, the way it dealt with that was to just use more violence. And in Britain, where the appearance of policing by consent has been so integral to Britain's imperial history, our strategy as abolitionists is to exploit these contradictions and to organise en masse to withdraw consent from British policing. So as this, in the midst of this growing movement, I'm so excited to be able to be here with Gina Dent and Beth Ritchie, and to have the opportunity, and fully intend to use this opportunity to get those nuggets of wisdom to take back to our organising. So this isn't going to be a loose women or the view kind of chat. It's going to be a praxis chat. I'm going to take this opportunity and hopefully use it wisely. And these questions were kind of developed with other members of Sisters Uncut and other comrades in the movement. So to kick us off, one of the things I most loved about this book was how rooted in internationalism. And it really goes against a lot of the kind of US exceptionalism that a lot of us abolitionists outside of the United States often feel is going on when we're interacting with abolitionist ideas. And we've such rich details of abolitionist organising from across the world. Why was the emphasis on internationalism so important? And why must the abolitionist movement be an internationalist one? And all my questions I'm going to throw out, and you can choose who wants to come in on that.
Shall I start, Beth?
Go for it.
First of all, just want to thank you for hosting us, the Black Feminist Bookshop, Housemans, and of course, Aviah. It's really wonderful to be with you. We so admire the work of Sisters Uncut. I first got to know some members of Sisters Uncut at Cambridge University, where there was a program some years ago, and it was very, very inspiring. So I'm very, very glad to be joining you this morning from California. And you've put your finger already on the situation that we were facing, which is that prison abolition is often thought of as a US project. Obviously it cannot be a US project. And, part of that is just because of the history of racial capitalism, imperialism, colonialism that you started to lay out. And part of that is because the structures of policing and punishment are well coordinated around the world, that people that are running these organizations and states that are participating are constantly in communication around strategies, around technologies, and sharing materials and sharing knowledges. And we need to be able to keep up with what is happening from the state perspective. But, more importantly, I think it's an opportunity for us to say something to the rest of the world about how we as academics and organizers have thought about our own projects. And it's always been very important, I think, to all of us in various different ways to stay connected to the global struggles and to not see our situations as exceptional. We, of course, are always functioning also at the micro level, the local level, where a lot of these struggles take place, but we need to be inspired and we need to be connected to the larger world. So first of all, I want to thank you for being gracious in your assessment of our book. We, of course, have many self-criticisms, and often one of them is that we have not been international enough. It was a short book, and we needed to keep to things that we knew well, and we wanted to talk about the spaces where we have had personal experience and have been connected to movements, so that we weren't just signaling and we weren't just describing places that we didn't really understand in terms of the movement. So there's a lot that's left out. We are also trying to avoid, I always use this phrase from a friend of mine who calls it the Flora and Fauna approach, where you just point to things around the world and you don't know much about them, but they're pretty, and so you lift them up, but it's not a deep engagement. So for us, the organizations that we mention are ones that we've been involved with or have collaborated with or supported. And those are the situations that we felt that we could convey to readers. So I'm glad that it feels satisfying to you. And for us, I think it's an ongoing project.
Thank you for that, Gina. And yeah, I was at that event that's with you at Cambridge, which seems like a million years ago. It was a beautiful, beautiful couple of days. But yeah, thanks for that lovely kind of setting us off on that the importance of internationalism. Beth, do you want to come in on that question?
I'm glad that Gina answered first, because she was her usual brilliant self on that question. I guess the only thing I would emphasize, certainly not add, is my deep appreciation for this invitation. And really, in some ways, the invitation is emblematic of what we're trying to remind ourselves to do and invite others to do. I mean, Sisters Uncut is, in my view, one of those organizations that I just sort of hold up and hold on to. The work that you've done is inspiring way across borders. And so not only have we meaning the United States, or them as the United States, I should maybe say, exported our apparatus of carcerality, and we need to be accountable for that. And so we need to have an international focus to our abolition work. It's also the case that we have learned a great deal from other places as abolition feminists. And as we think about not only being accountable for and dismantling the US influenced project of carcerality around the world, we also want to build in the spirit of a non-bordered abolition feminism. And so the invitation is to really constantly seek places where we can learn about what this world that we want to create looks like. And certainly both other people who were on the call, the webinar, I looked at some of the people on the chat, but also in particular, Sisters Uncut is part of who we want to be in partnership, sisterhood with. So you're sort of the answer to the question in many ways. Yeah, I'm a bit stunned by that, but we were very happy to get some mentions in the book. I'll tell you that much. The chat function was popping when we saw that, so that's really lovely to hear that. And yeah, so moving on to the next question, I kind of wanted to give a little bit of background to some important abolitionist organizing that's happening here, and like kind of pivot it to one of the examples in the book. As in the introduction, I was introduced as like being involved in Hackney Cop Watch. You can't see my t-shirt, but I tried to like. Oh, nice. Hi. Representing.
And yeah, so cop watch groups have been sprung up all over the country over the last year to kind of respond to this political moment. And one of the things we've been doing in Hackney recently has been organising around the child Q scandal, where a Black child was strip searched by police officers after her teachers called them to her school in Hackney to search her for marijuana, where she was strip searched while she was on her period. Disgusting, degrading incident of police violence and sexual violence. And abolitionist collectives that we're working with as well, such as No More Exclusions, which is a youth and educator-led collective, have been fighting really hard to get, the National Education Union, which is the largest education union in this country, to commit to no more police in schools and a moratorium on school exclusions, which is to intervene in that school to prison pipeline, and to no avail. Despite the whole country being in uproar about what happened to Child Q, they won't commit to a position on no police in schools. And in fact, actually last week, hundreds of Black teachers took the step to expose the racism of the National Education Union. But I was really intrigued by one of the examples in your book of the Chicago Teachers Union that had made really great inroads in kind of pivoting the organizing of their union to kind of quite abolitionist demands, one of which was to have sanctuary schools, so sanctuary away from immigration and customs enforcement. And I'm reflecting on where unions sit within an abolitionist strategy, because I've often found that the unions in this country that are most amenable to abolition are those smaller, more independent, working class, Black migrant-led, Uber drivers, Deliveroo. I'm thinking about United Voices of the World and Independent Workers of Great Britain. And with these big strides being made in the United States by Amazon Labor Union and Starbucks Workers United, who are, these are the unions that are at the moment taking the radical dynamic action that seems to be where the really interesting and exciting things are happening. So my question is, as abolitionists, how much should we balance trying to win back some of the bigger, more bureaucratized unions to get behind radical abolitionist demands? And how much should we balance that against maybe investing in this newer breed of smaller independent unions that have a lot of really radical and visionary members?
Well, I'll jump in since you mentioned both unions and Chicago. I am currently at the University of Illinois at Chicago, where I teach, our graduate students are on strike. The strike started yesterday, horrendous examples of the administration not yielding to that, the demands for a living wage, to not have to pay fees, and what's interesting to me, our students were on strike, graduate students were on strike 2 years ago, and there is a decidedly different rhetoric surrounding really the same demands that sounds much more abolitionist to me. And the reason it sounds more abolitionist is because it is bringing in questions of gender justice, bringing in questions about how the institution needs to respond to issues of sexual violence on campus. It's led much more this time by Black and brown students, questions of trans visibility. I mean, it's a whole different set of discussions, right? Surrounding really the same things, like we want to be paid well for our work. This university wouldn't run without us. Why should we pay fees? Why do we pay to work, et cetera? So I'm using that kind of as an example to say that for me, it's such a good question because it allows us to not only look at the structure of the union, but really what the union demands are and how the union is formulated in relationship to other issues. And so I think that the examples that you cited of what's happened around Amazon and Starbucks, I'm going to name UIC as part of that, is that we see in a really productive way that struggles around labor, struggles around sexualized violence in schools, around the school to prison pipeline, around education in general, feel much more responsible, much more accountable to a politic of abolition feminism in some instances. I think there are other instances where the same story prevails that has always prevailed, that these are bureaucratic, hierarchical institutions that are sort of full of sexism and heteropatriarchy, and demands are about rights for certain people. And I think those, to me, aren't places where those are places we need to be working against, if we're going to say before and again, working against, because they don't represent something different. They represent the rights for some people. They don't represent what we're trying to build as a feminist abolition future. And at the same time, I think we can use the growing labor rights movement that is much more radical, that is incorporating issues around not just anti-capitalism, but really around gender justice. If we can find those places and embrace the abolition within them, even name them as abolitionist spaces, led by feminists, queer visibility. I mean, I think we have an opportunity for really bringing the labor issue along in our abolition feminism struggle. I see it happening, on my campus and other places, around the world.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Beth. Gina?
Well, yes, Beth has the closest example, really, having been located in Chicago during those struggles. But I also want to lift up Oakland here. I'm speaking to you from Oakland, California, or unceded Ohlone territory. And the Oakland public school system was successful we were successful in fighting to remove police from the Oakland schools, which was a really important campaign that I want to lift up. And I want to say a little bit about how that happened, because I think that we focus sometimes only on the last thing that happens that makes a particular change. But in order for the success, I think, of removing police, I think a lot of the groundwork was laid because we've had a vibrant restorative justice program in Oakland schools for some time. Which was started by an organization called RJOY, Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth, which was initially founded by Fauna Davis. And that organization has been in place in schools doing alternatives to punishment, traditional punishment, retributive punishment, doing circles with students when there is harm, and also, importantly, training teachers and administrators into a culture that understands that the forms of punishment that were previously used to handle harms were not as successful, especially for children of color, children who were living in impoverished communities, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think it's really important to look at all of those ways in which it's possible to build over time new relationships and new kinds of ways of working so that people start to be called in to those kinds of strategies. These are the kinds of abolition feminist strategies that we really want to try to lift up. I also want to say that, one of the things we emphasize in the book, which comes from Black feminism, is the both and strategy. So part of what was in your question would have us think about how we'd have to shift our strategy toward these other independent, newer, emerging unions. But really, I think it's really important that we have a both and strategy, that we have people who are working in the unions already that exist, and we need them to also be on board. I will again lift up an organization, not just from California, but from the West Coast, the ILWU, the International Longshoremen Warehouse Union. And that organization, even though I didn't say the name very well, I have a cold, has been progressive historically. They have done work to support Mubi Abu Jamal. They have shut down the ports for a variety of causes, including Palestine. And so that organization is really, really important as a local union that has a lot of capacity in the entire West Coast from Canada down to Mexico for controlling our supply and trade. And so with that power, they have used that power for progressive causes. So I would say in that case, the big union has done a lot of work for us. And of course, these smaller emerging unions are very important. And I'm so very glad that we're starting to see really what I think of as the impact of the movements of the 90s and 2000s, where people were really starting to talk about capitalism for the first time, so that there are whole generations of people now who have that as part of the vocabulary. And that the Occupy Wall Street movement, which people who are from indigenous communities don't like to be called Occupy, so sometimes we use decolonize instead. But those movements have really contributed to a lot of understanding in young people of the problems of capitalism. And it is more true, I think, now as a teacher, that I find that students understand that they both live in capitalism, but that they can also fight against it simultaneously. And that living in contradiction is what we do, but we take a both and strategy. We try to address and mitigate whatever harms we find, but we also are working toward another way of living together and another way of being in the world. And so this is also part of what we think of as abolition feminism.
Great. So, comrades at No More Exclusions, you've heard it here. Keep on your fight, trying to make headway with the National Education Union. This is great. I'm having a really great time, by the way. I hope you both are too. So the next question I wanted to ask was, there's in the book, the issue of co-optation by the state kind of comes up in different parts, and broader co-optation. And I think it's probably fair to say that the British abolitionist movement was held back a fair bit by the fact of our welfare state, and a lot of our radical grassroots organizations in the 70s, 80s and 90s ended up getting state funding, which kind of obstructed open criticism of the state and of cops. I'm wondering if the kind of funding models in the US face similar or different problems. And, you know, when big philanthropic like organizations fund ostensibly abolitionist projects, does it make it less likely that those projects will refer to themselves as anti-capitalist or express solidarity with Palestine, for example? In short, how can we fund our abolitionist movements without conceding ground on our radicalism?
Another really good question. Before you added the end, how do we fund it? I was just going to say it's a simple yes. Yes, we have been and we will continue to be at risk of co-optation, at least co-optation, if we continue to rely on the state and its auxiliary not-for-profit industrial complex to set us free. I mean, we're trying to get free from that. And so they're not going to sort of pay us to set ourselves free. I mean, it's almost as simple as that, as I see it. Of course, it becomes more complicated because I think there's variation in what those organizations sort of look like. I mean, on the one hand, in the US, we have a Department of Justice, which funds in a very significant way some of the efforts to end gender-based violence. So that's very problematic. It leads to a sort of constant negotiation where even radical organizations are trying to kind of cut deals with the government to fund something other than more cops to respond to gender-based violence, et cetera, through the Violence Against Women Act, but through all other kinds of ways, right? So we have that at one end of the continuum, but also along that path of funding options, there are foundations or smaller groups of people who have wealth who look like they're trying to fund radical grassroots abolitionist praxis. But in fact, anytime there are kind of demands on what can be done and who can do it and what's required, and accountability to a funder as opposed to accountability to a community or people, it's always going to influence what you do. And I think in the US right now, there are very, very serious questions about what it means when you take money, even money that looks like it's going to be free money, to set yourselves free. In my experience, it doesn't work. I mean, I think with very, very few exceptions of some very small foundations, I'll name Crossroads Fund, for example, in Chicago. But that's a real exception. I think we have to be really careful about funding. I think this has been well rehearsed in discussions that Insight, for example, has had in the anthology, The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. And it means it will not be funded by mainstream organizations all along that continuum. And I think we have to be very careful, suspicious, cautious, and prepared to support our work in other ways. And I think the kind of attraction that people have now to the mainstreaming of abolition, which we talk also about in the book, leaves us maybe particularly vulnerable, especially if we don't have a historical understanding of how funding has become an arm of the capitalist state. And again, for me, the goal that we try to talk about in the book and that we try to live in our lives is this going to set us free? Is this going to support us building the world we want? And I haven't seen that relying on foundation support, and certainly not state support, because in many ways those are often the same thing, will bring us there.
That was a really great answer. Thank you, Beth. Gina, do you want to come on that question of co-optation?
Sure, and I agree. It was a great answer. Thank you, Beth. I guess I would say I'm someone who actually just received a grant not long ago from the Mellon Foundation to do a project on visualizing abolition. And I have to say my process of having received that grant was very positive, in the sense that there wasn't any attempt to censor what we were going to do. And they had a very different understanding of deliverables. In fact, the term never came up in that way. And I think some foundations are trying to put money toward efforts that are important. And I would say the only reason, though, that I would be taking that money is because I'm taking it into the University of California. I'm a state employee, and that money is not going to me or to a grassroots organization. It's going to the university to do certain kind of work. And that work is more conventional work in some ways, even though it's public facing, and hopefully will do a lot of transformative things in the world. So I want to admit to that before I gave an answer that might seem contradictory to my own patterns. But I would also say that I am somewhat disturbed at the degree to which we have, and sometimes in grassroots organizations and in non-university settings and in other places that I'm involved, started to model our own organizations on the corporate structures that we are fighting. And sometimes we just don't need as much money as we think. And the idea that having more resources, more actual dollars, translates into more power and more actual influence and better ideas and better work, I think is a false one. So I think one of the things that's really important is to think, what do we actually need to make this organization work? Now, sometimes we really do want to have organizations that can pay people for doing this work, because the people who are actually most likely to be in this work are often those who are either excluded from work because of conviction backgrounds or something else, or don't have dependents and other reasons why they couldn't do this work on a volunteer basis. And we don't want just the people who are elite and have capacity to be then the ones who are just able to donate their time. We don't want that model. But on the other hand, I don't think we need a model where we have CEOs and CFOs and we have all this administrative structure, and we have to do these incredible campaigns and have swag. And although I like your t-shirt, but sometimes, I'm getting these things and I'm thinking, oh, I don't know if I want another item made. I really want to connect with people and I want to be in conversations. And for me, that's also, as a scholar and as a teacher, it's about talking to people about ideas. It's about getting out there. And so for me, the receiving of the funding allowed me to be in connection with many more people and for us to broadcast our ideas more widely. But I don't think of it as money that's going into the kind of everyday things and work that the struggle really needs. So I guess that's the main thing. And I think we absolutely need to be cautious of the way we've all individually ingested a capitalist ethos. I sometimes talk about, the kind of modes of self-valuation that we have, where we treat information also like in an acquisitive way, like we're trying to get more things, we're trying to get more money, we're also trying to be known for more things and have more visibility and, submit to celebrity culture. And I think those things are the opposite of the things that really will make a difference, which is why I felt so very, very fortunate to be working on this book with 3 other people who've been in the movement for so long and who are capable of really seeing through the various different kinds of invitations to be the expert or be the known person or be the image of the struggle or be the leader, and are always trying to make sure that we are extending ourselves toward others and being in community and remembering what our place is and what our role is.
That was also
I just want to add, one of the things that that does occur to me in your question is also what is it that we want from the state, and what do we deserve from the state? And the state has a lot of resources. Money and other resources, and what of that is ours and should be sort of taken back or maybe gotten for the first time. And so to me, there's a kind of, as we're thinking about building the world that we want, I think one of the questions is, what kind of relationship do we want to have with the state? And how will that translate into our organizations being able to thrive and give to our communities in the way that we deserve to be given to? And so it's both a funding question, but it's kind of more broader in the sense of we can make some demands, and we can righteously accept the resources that we created, that we've generated for the state. And how do we do that in a way that doesn't lead to co-optation? I just believe that there is some way. And I think Gina's question is of what is it that we really need? What is it that we really want? Who has access to that? How do we lay claim to it? Not in a given way, but in a deserving way. I think these all become questions, not rhetorical questions, but really practical questions at some point. And it's almost it sort of begs the question of reparations. It begs all kinds of other kinds of questions around transfer of resources that I don't want to just sort of write off. I don't think we can only, build social movements through bake sales, although, we could do a few more of those maybe, but we have to have something else too. And the question is, what is it?
That was great. The reason why I asked that question is, we've got that history of like the welfare state kind of funding a lot of our grassroots movements, but actually the welfare state's gone now, and we're now very much more used to organising with £0 and 0 pence. And we're kind of like, trying to figure out, like, as we rebuild and learn from the mistakes of the past, like, okay, well, what lessons do we want to learn, and how do we want to, like, resource ourselves in ways that don't replicate a lot of that? So your answers were beautiful and great, and thank you for that. So my final question before going to throw it out to all of the attendees. So in a recent episode of the podcast, Millennials Are Killing Capitalism, Daruba bin Wahad, member of the New York Panther 21, decried the common chant around Black Lives Matter, or hashtag around that movement, hands up, don't shoot. And he questioned the suitability of employing the universal sign for surrender to signal a movement which is based on confrontation and struggle with a violent state. And so at Sisters Uncut, I want to kind of talk a little bit, like preface this with that we hold transformative justice and divestment from violence in our communities as pivotal in the abolitionist project and movement. And one of the things I guess I worry about, though, is, and you talk about the mainstreaming of abolition in the book, and one of the things I worry about with that is too heavily focusing on a kind of meeting a less punitive way of treating each other as individuals at the expense of the confrontation and class struggle aspects of abolitionist struggle, which I think is important, because policing and prisons are not going without a fight. I kind of, one of the things I'm thinking about as an abolitionist feminist is, the Black Panthers were good at training the community in hand-to-hand combat and how to handle guns, but were not so good at responding when that violence was turned inwards, especially towards women in the party. And I guess my question to both of you is, do you agree with Daruba bin Wahad that the abolitionist project is fundamentally one of confrontation with the violent state? And if so, as abolitionist feminists, can we hold the need to divest from violence in our communities whilst also building up our capacity to confront and resist the violent state?
Just looking to see who's going to start. So I guess I'll dive in. We talk a lot about the Black Panther Party, and now, of course, there are films and television programs and YouTube videos and a zillion other ways of getting to understand the Black Panther Party. But there's a book coming out before too long about women in the Black Panther Party. And partly because people have a misapprehension, I think, that was intentionally fostered also by people in the Black Panther Party about, the party being really centered by men and focused on these kind of gestures of masculinity. And of course, that was some of it. But there were more women in the Black Panther Party than men. And as is the case with all the organizing that we're familiar with, probably. And the work that people were doing every day was with children and in communities, and to create nurture where there had been neglect, and to do so many things that the state wasn't doing for those children. And I think we need to remember that also. And I say that because I think it's important that this revisionary work look at the Black Panther Party now is coming out, because I think it's also important for us to not misunderstand, first of all of the changes that have happened socially that make me far less capable of thinking about training ourselves in weaponry as a liberatory gesture. I do think that society has evolved, weapons have evolved, the states have monopoly on violence and can always outgun us. And so investing in that is really, really troubling. And I'm going to say, as someone who's very, very interested in the impact of visual culture, it is really hard for me to be talking, especially to young people, because I'm a teacher, about violence and in the communities that they live in, but also the violence that they're surrounded by, because the normative structures of our visuality are invested in the same forms of violence. So to back up to kind of the impulse of your question, I do think that we are confronting the capitalist state. That is our job. The question is, what does confrontation look like? And sometimes I think confrontation is a confrontation of ideas. Sometimes, it's about really trying to get people in communities to divest from the modes of power that are the ones that are seem most obvious, are most masculinist, are most directed by the violent histories of slavery and policing and colonization. And I have to say that I don't know that the gesture of people putting their hands up and saying, hands up, don't shoot, is just about saying, I surrender. I think it's also about saying, symbolizing for others who have not been the ones who have been subjected to those harms, that we are already submitted. We have already submitted to the state. In fact, we've already tried to be incorporated in as many ways as possible. When I think about other ways that it's very different than the period of the 1960s and 70s, we are less internationally engaged. And it goes back to your very first question. For me, if we're actually going to think about confronting the state, we also have to really think about the system of borders, the entire imagination we have about how we are all connected. And we've lost a lot of that. So I'm really interested in investing in the ways of collectivizing and of being with each other and of engaging with each other. And it doesn't have to look like the kind of women's peace movement of the past, but I do think it needs to be invested in new ways of being with each other and thinking of each other. If you think about someone like Adrienne Maree Brown, who talks about love being our language, what would it mean to have love be the language of our movements and of the future? And, those kinds of things I think are deeply serious. It's not just a simple thing to undo the impact of all of the forms of violence that we've been submitted to for generations. And I'm especially thinking about Black people here, but of course, many people throughout the world for very many reasons. And so I do think that we want to demand things. I think Beth was absolutely correct that we want to make sure that the money that we are paying in taxes and in other ways is actually returned to communities and is not used for weapons of war, for example, or for other things that we would object to, like policing. At the same time, I think we also need to figure out and have a broader vision that thinks about ways we would like to see it possible to save this planet. And we will not be doing that by our imagination being constrained to the forms of violent confrontation that have been engaged in the past.
I love that, Gina. I was like taking notes about, it is true of, our way of writing this book was so much about learning from each other. And your questions are so good because it gives us a chance to talk through ideas that we, sort of maybe talked about a little bit in the book or came up as part of the world was so changing as we were writing this book. So we sometimes had a chance to have these discussions, but it's thank you for the question. And Gina, thank you for the answer. So I want to say, I have a few ideas about this. None of them answer the question. They maybe add to the question a little bit that may be useful or may not. Gina, I'm thinking about your really important work on visual culture, visual representations. And I certainly think we don't want abolitionists to be perceived as surrendering. But when I think about hands up, don't shoot, the way I've seen it and heard it, it is resistance. It's not surrender. It's active. It's there's something about the actual raising of a hand that is movement. It doesn't feel like the surrender hands up. It feels like our hands are ready to do our work, to build our world, to push back, to resist. It feels active oriented. And again, I think the discussion that is raised about whether abolitionists are surrendering, either like symbolically or metaphorically or in real time, like it's not an active, aggressive move. I think that's an important discussion to have, but I think you can also interpret hands up, don't shoot, and how it has been represented in the streets as something different. Because it's often, we are going to keep pushing your police barricade back with our hands up. And it's almost like, not I dare you to shoot me, but we are moving forward anyway. So I think that's a different interpretation. I think second, there was something in your question that made me want to make sure we lift up the way that we are internally to feminist abolitionist formations, having discussions about strategy and what strategy we use at what time and who decides what strategy is going to work best. And I think one of the benefits, one of the beautiful things about abolition feminism is we have a lot of different options about what slogan to use, what strategy to privilege, what's going to be the object of our campaign. And in some ways, there's so much work to do. We can do a lot of different work, but it says to me that these are strategic decisions that we make at certain times. And if we're marching in the streets and we're facing, a row of armed police officers and we want to keep moving, hands up, don't shoot might be the right thing to say at that moment, right? That's not a movement position. That to me is a strategy at one point to make sort of the point I think that Gina was making. And I think the last thing is somehow this question invites attention to the question of criminalized survivors who use self-defense to protect themselves, and the kind of organizational ethos that, for example, Sisters Uncut has, and so many other organizations, Love and Protect, Survived and Punished, that people have the right to defend themselves when every legitimate form of protection has been stolen from them. And of course you have to defend yourselves, and we will defend you defending yourself, right? That's part of what our abolition work is. Now, we can't only have that, because that means that people have been harmed, and what we're doing is trying to reverse the negative consequences of being criminalized because you're harmed. But when you are harmed, you should have the right to defend yourself, absolutely. But it also means we have to build a world where people don't have to defend themselves, either metaphorically or practically, like real time, materially, so that we're not in that position of chasing after criminalized use of harm. And, we have to kind of find some way to bring all of that into what our abolition praxis is. And I think, again, feminist abolition can do that because we can hold multiple ideas at the same time. It means we can have different interpretations of the same slogan, because at different times it might mean different things used by different people, right? So the sort of absolute declaration about use of violence or non-use of violence. Is it resistance or is it confrontation? Is it surrender or is it a kind of active resistance to what's in front of you? It just depends. It's contextualized. It depends, who's using it, how do we interpret it? And nothing for me at this point is off the table. And I think that there's a context for understanding how decisions about what to do next has to be included.
Beautiful. I really appreciate you both and your really honest engagement with what is a difficult question. And the reason why, it's kind of pertinent, I think, to us is because, we're thinking about these strategies and we're developing these strategies. And I really wanted to use this opportunity to just kind of like get your reflections on that. So I really, really appreciate you engaging with that. I mean, one of the things that we're kind of like doing and what I'm kind of thinking of in that question is, the examples where, of mass resistance to immigration raids, like in Glasgow last year, hundreds and hundreds of people turned out and physically intervened in an immigration raid. And I think we're seeing more and more expressions of this physically getting in the way of the state. And that takes risks. People will get hurt. And I guess what I'm thinking about is how do we build up our capacity, get better, still come out, take those risks, and get better at it and scale that up. I genuinely appreciate your engagement, and I think that's a lot of food for thought. And I think we're going to go into, so chemistry, 13th of May 2021 is the example of the immigration, big victory of immigration resistance in Glasgow last year. We're going to go to questions. And where do I look for questions? If people want to ask questions now is the time to do it. So is it okay? So it's in the Q&A. So we've got one question so far as I can see. It says, I used to believe that love had always to be non-violent. I've changed my view now. Can this panel speak to the weaving together / expression of love in violence, if at all?
I'm just going to start, but it's just going to be a train of thought. So, I think the problem with some of these questions around violence for me is often that I think a lot of the work we were doing, not only in the book, Abolition, Feminism Now, but also in the movement, is reframing what gets labeled violent and what gets labeled loving. And I was taught especially a really important lesson about this when I visited Palestine in 2011 as part of a group of women of color and Indigenous feminists. And they were really powerful presentations that we benefited from. And a number of them really were around this question of who gets labeled as violent, right? And so, even, some kind of Muslim organization of people trying to, I don't know, support each other through some, mosque or something gets labeled violent, or and we know as Black people, pretty much anywhere you live in the world, that a group of Black people can be perceived by others as violent in ways that are sometimes funny for us, but often lead to tragic consequences. So I think part of it is that by my definition of violence, I wouldn't see that there's any love in violence. But in order to get to that position, it would require the reframing of so many things that have been presented to us as nonviolent, like state structures and powers, and also rethinking and reframing those of us that have been labeled consistently as violent and represented as violent in all of our interactions. I'm thinking a lot these days, we referenced it, but Dorothy Roberts, who is a scholar from University of Pennsylvania, has a book that may be out already on what she calls the family policing system, which is her term for the child protective services or the state organizations that are intended to prevent violence against children or harm to children in homes. But of course, we know that institution itself has a very violent history. And so that the forms of protection that were provided for children are the very things that we'd want to try and prevent. And so for that reason and many other reasons, Dorothy Roberts has called the system the family policing system and wants us to extend our analysis into that arena, which we do a tiny bit in the book and following her. And I think this is incredibly important. So I'm taking this question, which is really asking for a more definitive answer, to say that, if now then we reframe things in the ways that I would want to think of them and call out violence where I would see it or where the movement would see it, then I would say, no, there wouldn't be love in violence. However, it is all perceptual. I think we're also in a moment where, and I'm just going to be a little, I should be careful here, but, this Me Too era, which we also address a little bit in the book, is a bit difficult as well. I mean, in the Me Too era, for example, people have tried to say that the calling out of people who have done harm is of primary importance, and sometimes those forms of calling out can happen in fairly violent ways. And so, what does it mean to actually then use a form of carceral feminism to address the kinds of harms that I think all of us as authors and all of us probably on this call understand are problems that we need to solve, but trying to solve them within the grammar of violence that we already have and within the organization of power that we have is going to be our problem. So, really one of the reasons I quoted Adrienne Maree Brown earlier on love is that we're not very good at it. We're both not good at it, and we also have a long history of looking back at how, people loved under slavery and people loved under colonization. And so we use those to inspire ourselves. But on the other hand, we also know how much harm was also in that, right? It's one of the reasons why Black families often have still use corporal punishment. And I'm talking about Black families because I'm a Black person, it's easier. But, and that's something that, in households is still discussed as something like, I get to put my hands on my child. And it's a much more complicated thing to tease out when that is about trying to equip our children with the capacity to exist in the world. And when that's an extension of all the violence that's been enacted on us. So I think that these are questions that we're going to be trying to think about for a long time.
Thank you, Gina. Do you want to comment on that, Beth?
Well, I didn't know at first how to answer the question, but Gina's comments, I'll share my kind of just random thoughts about it. I'm not calling your thoughts random, Gina. I think part of what we're trying to do in abolition feminism now is to invite a kind of emotional affect into the work of freedom again. And I don't think it ever sort of left, but I do think there are some practices that that almost assume that there isn't human connection, some political practices, that there isn't human connection or relationality engaged in it. And so when I think about talking about love or care, even mutual aid or hope or or dignity and those kinds of words that have, for me, deep and important political meanings, that I want them to be part of our vocabulary because I want the practice of them to be possible as part of our work. So that's sort of one thing that Gina's comments reminded me of. And I think similarly, violence has become a way of kind of individualizing events instead of thinking more structurally. And I think it, for me, starts to invoke things like crime or, something that is like the state's understanding of harm that suggests a set of responses that are decontextualized and focused on monitoring or surveillance or individual behavior, not sort of build, fabric and circles of people affected by different actions. And again, I think abolition feminism allows us to think more nuanced about those things, both the words, but also how the words land on what it is that we think we need to do. So I think if we think a little bit more broadly about the words, there is a way to think about how in the name of love, violence is used sometimes. And that doesn't mean that there isn't love. It means that the violence shouldn't happen there. Something else needs to replace that, right? And in the name of, so I think it allows us to kind of think about those things. And I think as Gina said, there's something quite particular about it for Black people and people of African descent in relationship to abolition and policing. And the discussions that families have about, I'm going to get you first because I don't want you got to learn how to behave when you get out in the world, and those kinds of things that are both about parenting, but also about protection of our communities. So I'm rambling here a little bit to say that I think the question is actually one that I want to think a little bit more about. And I think I want to bring, invite others and myself, bring questions around both definitions of terms, but also what the Abolition Feminist Project is about use of language and what that means in terms of political action.
Thank you, Beth and Gina, for those great answers. I'm kind of thinking as you're speaking about this kind of question of violence, and I guess like one of the things that you said, Gina, was around that kind, like bring us back to that kind of internationalism and internationalist like struggle. And I'm kind of reminded of examples, like the women in Rojava who, their struggles for liberation that have also held like fundamentally like feminist values, whilst also, physically fighting, physically confronting an imperial, imperial force. And, similarly in Palestine. And so, I guess, I'm thinking about how we can, if we're not in that situation here in Britain and in the US, but, how we can show our solidarity to those struggles seems really fundamental. Like our route to liberation seems really invested in those struggles. If we're going to get there, we're going to have to back them up. Anyway, that's just like an aside. Not an aside, but it's just like musings. So I'm going to read out Kelsey's question. Sometimes it feels like such an insurmountable task to abolish prisons in the UK or the USA, where the criminal justice system is so wide-reaching and there are so many institutions. And I've been thinking about looking to nations like the Caribbean, where they maybe have 1 or 2 prisons in the country. Do you have thoughts on how we can work alongside countries in the global south to abolish prisons as part of the decolonial project?
Well, that's a great question. Really good question, because as you suggest, we have to be working alongside other places in the world to learn something about how to do it better in places like the US. So why are there only 2 prisons, right? And what's happening anyway instead? And how are people feeling safe? Are there other structures of accountability? Is this a resistance movement, or just the development hasn't happened yet, or what? So I think to me, it's entering into not just what we can do to help, but what we can learn from other places. And I would say that one of the questions that I rattled off, are people feeling safe? Are people, it is not I mean, that's maybe the starting question, because to me, a place without prisons isn't necessarily a place where there's no carceral state. What are the other possible, and I'm using these as broad questions, not specific, but are there other carceral systems that keep people, that disappear people, that keep people not living in community with each other? Is there investment in a different kind of carcerality, and what's the resistance movement to those other forms of carcerality? So to me, how do we ask questions to learn both about a political praxis here, wherever the here is, that, wherever you are, but also how to not ask only the question about prisons and a certain kind of obvious policing, but also about even the long-term effects of a colonial system and what that's done in terms of people's ability to work or live certain places, or an educational system, or gender-based violence, or all of the other things that are part of what the feminist abolition project is.
Great. Gina, do you want to comment on that?
Sure. I mean, that's really a huge question and huge area. I want to refer to the work of Baz Dreisinger, who has a book called Incarceration Nations, and has actually been doing a lot of work globally on incarceration, which I think is so important. And, part of the question gets to the word that Beth raised, and I think we need to be super cautious, which is the word development. We need to be incredibly alert to the degree to which any structural adjustment program or any quote unquote pro-democracy initiatives are tied to the definition of democracy that extends from the West. And right now we could talk about the UK and the US. And I think that is deeply dangerous. One of the things we try to do in the book, and that I think about all the time, is the historical roots of the at least in the US, the idea of democracy. We when we teach these issues, we teach back to Tocqueville, whose definition of democracy in America had a lot to do with the existence of the prison system, and the fact that system was then to be promoted around the world as the primary sign of democracy. So as activists who work on the left and who are working in abolition movements, we really need to spend some time on working on our own definitions of democracy, and thinking about our own role, especially when we're in the UK and the US, in globalizing the dangerous definition of democracy that's been promoted from the West. So I think these spaces where we talk about there only being two prisons, unfortunately, that's generally not because people in those locations were necessarily thinking about this as an alternative to the pattern of incarceration, but rather it's perceived as exactly what Beth pointed out, a lack of development. And we need to, be working across the globe with people who are in various locations to say that we don't want to move in a direction of evolving into more appropriate levels of prisons and jails available to hold people. And this is a really difficult and painful conversation sometimes. I'm thinking back to a conversation that I had with some friends maybe 20 years ago, South African, who were involved in governance of various kinds in the post-apartheid era, and were wrestling with how to fund their government, to fund the initiatives they wanted, and were in the process of thinking about private prisons, and in having a discussion with some of us who are abolitionists, they were saying, oh, well, we know that the causes of incarceration in prison are and the causes of crime are poverty, and so when we address poverty, we'll be able to get rid of these prisons. But our argument was, if you build them, you will have them. And so if you structure society through this carcerality, you will then have a carceral society. So in the post-apartheid era, really thinking seriously with people about what it means to be liberated is really important. The same conversation I had with people in Palestine, where the prison system and the jails are considered obvious tools of colonization and are used against the Palestinian people. And so everyone understands that people who are incarcerated are political prisoners. Doesn't matter what age you were incarcerated, because so many children are being incarcerated repeatedly in Palestine, in, you know, even what wouldn't look to us like a resistance to the Israeli policy. So I'm saying all of this to point out that in many situations, especially in movements toward liberation, we're not having the conversation soon enough about what kind of societies we want to build. And the model of a developed society and a model of a strong state and a nation that can sustain itself is something that we absolutely have to be engaged with. And it starts to feel like at the end of this conversation that we are saying abolition feminism means you need to do everything. And it's true. To quote Ruthie Gilmore, change everything is pretty much what it requires. And it won't happen today. And I think this is one of the things about the movement that requires incredible humility, is that we know that we probably won't live to see the changes that we're fighting for, but we need to do the work anyway, that the work is not so much for us individually, but it's for future generations. And this also means, and I've referenced this before, thinking about the environment and thinking about whether or not we will have future generations given what humans are doing to this planet. And incarceration is a part of those bad patterns. And so there's no way that we can be involved in this without thinking in complex ways about how to get rid of the forms of violence that incarceration represent. And we need to make sure that the term democracy is not held by those states that are proffering this form of quote unquote justice as the future.
Great. So the next question I had on here was, can you please share your thoughts on the recent media attacks on Patrisse Cullors and the critiques on Black Lives Matter Foundation choosing to buy/invest in property? How can abolitionist feminism guide us when our movements are continuously delegitimized?
Well, that's a super question. Should have been ready for it, because it is the topic of lots of debate and sadness, actually pain, worry about what's happening here. So a couple of things. These aren't kind of conclusive statements. You know, it is really amazing how vicious media attacks can be about success. And it is clear that there is a targeting of the most visible activists who, in some ways are positioned to be the most vulnerable when in fact change is happening. And so, whether it's kind of overt surveillance from the police, or whether it's the media going after people in leadership in Black Lives Matter or other formations, the movement for Black Lives. I mean, it's not, it should have been anticipated, and it's not surprising. So that's like point number one. I think also I want to go back to something that Gina said, and I'm not going to make a statement about the specifics of this, but more generally, that we need to be strategic about how we are kind of commodifying leadership, and what kind of like big high profile, I don't know how to say it, like power moves people are making, so that that attention can be so easily targeted toward us, right? And again, this is not specific to that situation, but I do worry that we are not careful enough about identifying a certain kind of leadership that sort of gets all, maybe doesn't take, but is getting all the credit, is doing all of the media appearances, is writing all the books, is, you know, sort of taking up a certain kind of space, that the high visibility means the attraction of violent criticisms, you know. Now, I don't mean to, I want people to hear that as not sort of blaming the victim in that, but I do think as a movement, we need to talk about what is happening here, and how a different kind of collective shared visibility would make it harder for people to pick people, make it harder for the power against us to pick us off one by one in these very, very public ways, where you discredit one person and therefore you discredit a whole movement, and you discredit the years of activism that went in to build that movement. And I mean, like, the years and years and years of activism, and the whole set of demands become perceived to be hypocritical and non-legitimate, and yet people are still struggling in the streets and no one even knows their name, right? And so I think there's a way that we as a movement need to take some accountability for it, and we as a movement need to say, back off. We see what you're doing in terms of this kind of scapegoating and attack. And I just want to say out loud that it is very, very, these are very difficult discussions that people are having in, you know, appropriately in the most intimate spaces of this movement right now.
Thank you for that, Beth. Gina?
Yeah, I really actually want to endorse everything that Beth said. I think she's really answered it. I didn't want to not say anything because I think this is a question that I don't want to be avoiding. It's a question that a lot of us are grappling with. And this is something that since Beth referenced what I was talking about earlier, I'll just try to say it a slightly different way here. You know, as the money is coming into our movements, and a lot of money is shifting right now from places that we didn't ever imagine that it would. And how do we deal with that? How are we training ourselves to think outside of capitalism? How are we training ourselves? You know, how are we studying capitalism? How do we know, you know, about alternatives? You know, socialism in the United States has, you know, almost disappeared, and then suddenly there's a slight resurgence. But I think people are uncertain about even what the definition is. There's so many different factions, and so having really deep conversations that focus on our economic system and how we want a different one and what that different one would look like. Those conversations don't happen enough as far as I'm concerned. And I think they don't happen enough for a variety of reasons, including what we've been saying today, which is a lack of internationalism. You know, you really can't understand global capitalism and racial capitalism without being able to think globally. And this is something that we have to encourage in movements. And it does not mean we don't care for those who are right next to us. We absolutely do. And it doesn't mean that we're just trying to have, you know, representatives who can have some kind of global elite who just travel to each other and network. It has to be something much more substantial. So to address the actual question, and maybe for some context for people who don't know what's going on, Patrisse Cullors is one of the three, and this is an awkward term, co-founders of Black Lives Matter. And that's already a controversial statement, because the whole point about Black Lives Matter initially was that it was a leader-full movement, not a movement of three leaders, has been particularly attacked. And I think part of the reason is that, you know, she's in LA, she's involved in film, she's writing books, and there are other ways in which she's a public figure beyond the movement that have made her a target. And we need to understand that she is a target. So we also need to defend her. At the same time, as Beth pointed out, we have to have these conversations about how we want to live and how we're going to model the ways of using the monies that are coming to us, and maybe sometimes refusing monies. Because, you know, the money that people are talking about, and I'm not talking about Patrice personally now, but the Black Lives Matter money that came in, most of that money was not foundation money or state money. It was individual small donors sending money because they believed in a cause and they were involved in it. And so how do we deal with a moment when so many people are engaged in our movements that we actually are able to amass real funds? And I would say those funds are never going to contest the funds the state can amass against us. So we're, you know, even the $10 million that BLM announced that it had is nothing compared to what the state has to advertise the success of whatever initiative is going on. But we really need to be together and to support each other, and then also to work to creating alternatives that are that provide some sense of access to things people have been denied, but some limits on the way in which we think about modeling ourselves on those who have oppressed us.
Thank you for that. And it really makes me think about some of the things that has happened here in Britain. You know, Black Lives Matter UK got £1 million from having £0 and 0 pence, and being, you know, 2020, a relatively inactive group, and then suddenly having £1 million, and, you know, that can be a really difficult and destabilizing thing. And I think my, you know, comrades in Black Lives Matter UK would say, like, wouldn't mind me saying that was not easy. And, you know, how you then manage that. And, you know, they had a lot of criticism and suspicion, like, thrown at them when they were doing their jobs. They don't work for Black Lives Matter. They were trying to figure out a democratic way to deal with this. And yeah, there's questions there around, when we fundraise, what are we fundraising for? What do we want to, you know, like, do we have an idea of, like, what we want or need the money for before we get it? Because actually, if you don't, you know, I think the learnings that we've all had in the movement here is that it's probably not a good idea to put a fundraiser link out there until you know what you're going to do with the money. And that you've had that conversation beforehand and you've built up that relationship with each other to come to those conclusions collectively. But yeah, the attacks, you know, are really, really difficult, you know, and we want to be able to have those conversations and accountable conversations in ways that are helpful to us all. I think we're coming towards the end now. I think, you know, I want to say thank you so much to Gina Dent and Beth Ritchie for a really beautiful evening for me, daytime or of whatever times there is going on for you. Yeah, you've been fantastic. The book, like I said, couldn't have come at a better time for us. It's been a really seriously rich resource for us in our organizing, like emerging abolitionist organizing. And also, you know, there was a little plug at the beginning. Me and a comrade in Sisters Uncut, Shanice, are currently writing a book. And I can tell you this book is full of furious annotations and underlines and is going to be very much cited in our book too. So thank you so much for everything that you've done. Yeah, I don't know if Black Feminist Bookshop want to come in with any closing thoughts. Oh yeah, sorry. I want to just plug, because I mentioned Cop Watch and the Cop Watch movement lots of times. I'm gonna put how to join your local Cop Watch in the chat. Sorry, I'm gonna shut up now.
That's brilliant. As the Black Feminist Bookshop, we just want to thank all of the audience members for joining this evening. And please do come into Houseman's and support the Black Feminist Bookshop on Patreon. Yeah, have a lovely evening, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much for having us and for such a great discussion. Appreciate the questions and your attention, everyone.
Yeah. Stay strong.